In this video, we're going to discuss postmodern and global art. From the late 1970s to the early 1980s, we start to notice that artistic impulses and drives to create modernist work are dwindling. As we've seen throughout history, artists are responding to the generations before them, breaking or expanding upon their rules, but the urge to rebel against a norm quieted a bit now because the norm itself had become rebellion. And as a whole, artists of the present generation are not as concerned with techniques like perfecting a form or creating something beautiful or even fine-tuning their sense of sight. Now they find themselves more interested in commenting on life, especially as it relates to their personal experience. So one such movement was Neo-Expressionism. And, as its name suggests, it's a new sort of expressionism, using many of the techniques of past expressionists while focusing more on personal and emotive subjects. These artists diverged from modernists like conceptualists or minimalists because they sought to be expressive and intimate instead of more impersonal, cold, and analytical. One such artist was Susan Rothenberg, who utilized heavy brushwork and symbolic subjects that themselves teetered on the brink of being unrecognizable among the background elements. Another neo-expressionist is Anselm Kiefer, who himself used an expressive paint application as combined with 19th century sentiments for history and mythology. For his work, he tried to give an equal attention to the moral content as well as the aesthetic concerns, often playing with both to load his paintings full of symbolism. He's also known for using alternative media within the paint, so sometimes it's a substance like ash that kind of sits on the surface, or it's something like straw or even clothing that protrudes off and into the viewer's own space. This is also a time when we see a major use of relational aesthetics, which was not restricted to any specific medium, more so the interactions with the work. As a theory, relational aesthetics relies on viewers to reach their full potential. To be truly realized, these works have to have interactions, whether that be the audience interacting with the object, the space, or the other people around them. All of those components are part of the work itself. It could even include some sort of guide that leads the viewer through a certain work, something as simple as instructions that say take one, or even a machine that responds to a viewer's presence, like a motion sensor or even a showcase surveillance feed. In the image that we see here, the artist has piled a, quote, endless supply of individually wrapped candy in multicolored cellophane, end quote, to create a portrait of his partner who died of AIDS. It utilizes relational aesthetics because the audience is invited to take a piece of the candy with them. The pile initially weighed the same weight as Gonzalez Torres' partner before he got sick, and as the public comes and takes pieces of him away, it shows how his illness diminished him away, just like this pile of candy will. As a sculpture, it's simply incomplete without audience interaction. Looking now at postmodern photography, we see a shift of artists directly staging their subjects with stark intentionality, instead of finding or happening upon them. Especially within the digital age, photography as fact is no longer the prevalent conception of the medium. For instance, Cindy Sherman plays into the strong staging of her photos in order to create satirical depictions of female characters, reflecting on the social expectations and ideas of pop culture. Another postmodern photographer, Vic Muniz, known for his medium-bending artwork, created a series called Pictures of Garbage, in which he traveled to Brazil to its largest landfill and photographed the garbage pickers there. He then paid them to help him arrange the trash into that likeness before photographing the final result. He worked among the people, depicted them, shared their stories in a documentary titled Wasteland, and then held the exhibition in Brazil for them to attend, donating all the proceeds from sales to their union. Postmodern photography as a movement aims to overtly play with stereotypes in order to make a commentary about contemporary society. Hassan Hajjaj does just this with the work that we see here. It's part of a series that he created depicting women on motorcycles in Muslim veils covered in corporate logos. The example shown here shows a woman in conservative Muslim dress, posed very confidently and defiantly, juxtaposed against the exaggerated yet ironic product placement from the Fanta cans shelved in the frame to the logos in her veil. Moving on now to sculpture, postmodern sculpture really responded to the digital age and how new technologies opened up many doors for exploring different media, as opposed to the traditional methods of just building, carving, and casting. One sculptor, Anish Kapoor, investigates shapes and their symbolic meanings, from works in solid colors to giant reflective monuments like Cloudgate or, quote, The Bean in Chicago. The example here is meant to allude to ancient religious structures like Indian stupas, Mayan pyramids, and domes, looking at how forms can contextually relate to architecture. He also sprinkled these works with powder to emphasize their connections to ritual. In her work, Rachel Harrison reflects on the culture of today, mediating on the real and the representation of that, quote, real. From social media to advertising, we're drowning in the synthetic. And her work, This Is Not an Artwork, delves into these topics using materials like fake wigs and fake vegetables with a cheap table. Another sculptor, Josh Klein, responds to these modern times more so through his process and materials by using 3D printing. 3D printing allows artists to bring the digital into the spatial and the physical, while allowing very precise models to be made from reality as well. And an example of the latter is the work that we see here, which includes 3D printed sculptures of shoe designers wearing their own designs. Printmaking saw shifts of its own during the postmodern, innovating both in and outside of the gallery. Starting with installation, artists like Swoon challenged the expectation that a print must be flat, on paper, in a frame, or even on the wall at all. Beyond the print shop, artists have brought their materials into the community through events like steamroll printing, allowing the print process to move from the institution into the world for education and community building. In addition, printmaking from stickers to stencils is prime for guerrilla art, which describes an artist taking their work to the streets in an anonymous, usually without invitation manner. Like I just mentioned, putting up stickers or spray painting stencils. There are also contemporary artists who are challenging traditional definitions of printmaking, whether building off of Warhol's use of multiples, who especially leaned into the industrial process of silkscreen that was previously not even considered an art process. And then you have other artists who are embracing the singular through monotypes. And these artists are creating works using objects that have a history and a conceptual weight, like Catherine Watts, who collects litter to ink it, print it, and dispose of it properly. Or myself, inking up and printing COVID masks that were previously worn by members of my family working in the medical field during a pandemic. There's an immediacy and an intimacy to these objects that have past lives, and this adds layers of the personal, the conceptual, and the critical, which are all staples to the postmodern. Originating in ancient times, public art is usually commissioned by an institution, like a government, religious organization, university, or really anyone with enough money and space to do it. For instance, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in DC was commissioned by the US government. Reflecting the concerns of the postmodern, today's public art is made to respond to the needs, concerns, and hopes of the broad masses of people, especially as it pertains to the community where the work is installed. The work that we see here is meant to embody the environmental concerns of the Eastern Washington agricultural community. And it does this partially by its aesthetic, but also in its function, like the water temperature, flow level, and amount of dissolved gases in the nearby Mill Creek. Looking at public art, it's also important to note that, quote, street art is technically considered public because it's public and it's art, though the differentiation is made between public and street or graffiti or guerrilla, depending on whether or not the art was invited or if it was put there by the artist's own initiative. In the 1970s, the increased availability of and access to spray paint led to a surge in graffiti, street art, and guerrilla art. And wherever you draw the lines between those things is a bit blurry because there's a lot of overlap. Banksy is the most well-known street artist, though ironically unknown because they are anonymous, and this artist is famous for their works that serve as criticisms for contemporary life, aiming to satirize the failings of modern society like consumerism, racism, the art world, and much more, literally making their mark on surfaces like streets, walls, and buildings. The artist also created a documentary about their process in the 2010 film Exit Through the Gift Shop. A large majority of postmodern artists are linking their work to current social issues, seeing solely aesthetic work as a distraction from reality, rather than a reflection or even call to action. In doing this, artists have range in intention from pure criticism to simple awareness and intrigue, pulling audiences into an issue in order to prompt further investigation. For instance, this map-like work by Tiffany Chung addresses the United Nations data on how conflict affects the flow of Syrian refugees. Another example by Theaster Gates aims to bring a community together into a collaborative, creative space. The structure that we see here functioned as a performance space, holding events 24 hours a day for 24 days, inviting local choirs, musicians, poets, political speakers, and others to come together for a restorative community event. Moving on to the term post-internet, which, unlike its name implies, does not mean that the internet is over. Rather, it addresses art created once the internet has been established. Post-internet art is an interdisciplinary cross-media movement responding to the networking of contemporary life in the digital age, addressing the themes of exchange and sharing through hyperconnectivity and surveillance. We as a society interact with technology far differently than in the past, which sounds very obvious to say, but that's the focus of this type of artwork, how society's expectations and conventions have changed on a large scale, in addition to a smaller, more interpersonal levels. As with most new and technology-based work, the post-internet does not have distinct boundaries, but rather ambiguous and vague guidelines. For one, there's not much consensus about what it actually describes. Is it art that's using technology to generate the work, like AI or software-based art? Or perhaps it's used to display it, like interactive websites? Or does it simply entail any art created within modern non-traditional methods during this time period? No matter how it's precisely defined, it will forever be difficult to contain because technology itself incessantly advances, interweaving itself into the culture and back again. Here we see an example of post-internet artwork by Rafael Rosendahl, in which he's created a software program that works in tandem with web browsers in order to translate any web page into an abstract composition, building on the Gestalt aesthetic. The website used in this image is IMDb, and the artist noted the date that he accessed the website as well, which is another reflection upon the post-internet because internet subject matters really are ever-changing. He then takes this abstract software-generated design to a tapestry factory, commissioning them to design it to be woven into the final work of art. In doing this, he creates a direct comparison between units of a whole, like pixels or stitches, even more interestingly as a comparison of the digital and the physical. Further, his abstraction software can be shared and downloaded by users so that they can create their own digital designs, yet another staple of the post-internet movement and time period. So what? Why does any of this matter? Well, for one, we've tracked these same art disciplines throughout history and now moved into the now. Looking specifically at the advances in tech, we can see how today is defined by communication, travel, and the internet, and how all of these components bring us all further and further into a more globalized world, instantaneously spreading innovative work as it emerges, just for others to respond and build onto it. Creative expression itself is and always has been a response to being alive, and the creativity of artists serves to activate our own creativity as viewers, in addition to helping us work through emotions or learn about issues in a new light. And though the avenues change with time, artists interact with life through their work, searching to find purpose and meaning in it, which works on individual and societal levels. And that's kind of why art matters. It's intellectual, it's emotive, it's expressive. And as we've seen, art has sort of no boundaries. Whenever we create them, artists defy them. And there's something really special about that. As this is the conclusion of all of our lectures throughout the semester, I think it's worth reflecting on the sentiments discussed before we began. A resounding contemporary art is weird, echoed by I don't know but I'm excited to learn. Really, two beautiful starting places. And while both responses are every bit as valid at this moment as they were on day one, I hope you leave these lectures with a bit more context for the weird and a level of comfort in the uncomfortable, such that now you can access contemporary art in ways that maybe you hadn't have thought of or even wanted to before. And with that, I will now conclude this final lecture. As usual, stay safe, get some sleep, and I'll see you all in class.